Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be looking at the next book in our book review series. And this is a book on Gnosticism, as this author is comfortable using it. And the author is Jonathan Cahana-Blum, Wresting with Archons, Gnosticism as a Critical Theory of Culture, published by Lexington Books in 2018. This is a fascinating book, and I have to give my disclaimer here that I'm not a person trained in the critical theory of culture, and I'm coming at this book very interested in its application to Gnosticism. I am a historian, and so I'm going to be checking the historical details. So let's launch this and see what we have.
Okay, so let's look at the basic data here. The book is an application of the critical theory of culture to Gnostic sources. But Cahana-Blum's scope is wider. If I can try to put this in my own language, he believes that Gnostics have postmodern concepts, problems, and also solutions, that they reject the very construction of bodies and gender and sex, all of these traditional concepts, and the practices that emerge from those concepts, namely the heteronormative practices. So this is a very philosophically informed kind of a book, but Cahana-Blum wants to emphasize that he's also doing historical work, and I'll have opportunity to test that claim as well.
Prior to publishing his book, Cahana-Blum has shown himself to be an industrious writer of journal articles and book chapters. And as he points out, chapter 2 is more or less a combination of two previously published articles. None of Them Knew Me or My Brothers in the Journal of Religion, and Androgen or Undrogen in Newman. Cahana-Blum also makes extensive use of an article on radical feminism that he wrote in a book. All of these can be found in his bibliography. And I just mention here that the bibliography includes other articles which have obviously informed this book, which seems to be the capstone of Cahana-Blum's thinking, and we are grateful that he has put it all together here.
If I were to boil this down into its most basic thesis, it is, as it's simply stated, that Gnosticism is, in fact, an ancient form of the critical theory of culture. It's not just the modern application of the critical theory of culture to Gnostic movements and practices. It is the claim that actually Gnosticism is its own critical theory of culture as it existed in the ancient world. And according to this critical theory of culture, the very creation of sex and gender is problematized. Gender and sex should never have existed in the first place, according to Cahana-Blum's interpretation. But basically anything in terms of the traditional heteronormative reality, so to speak, it comes under Gnostic criticism, because they are the greatest critics of their own culture. In his introduction, Cahana-Blum takes the opportunity to distinguish himself and his approach from all the other competing or major competing approaches to Gnostic and Nag Hammadi studies. And it is somewhat surprising, given the current state of the field of Gnostic studies, that Cahana-Blum more or less repudiates Michael Williams, that we can't speak of Gnosticism. and that we should speak it instead of biblical demiurgy. It seems that Cahana-Blum basically rejects this position in total. He's more sympathetic to Karen King's political reading of Gnostic texts, but also disagrees with her that we can't use Gnosticism. And the really surprising thing is that despite the mountain of criticism against Hans Jonas, which has been published by Karen King and others, basically Cahana-Blum positions himself as a follower of Jonas, who used existentialist philosophy to talk about what Gnosticism was, and gave us an incredibly modern and modernizing language for talking about Gnosticism, and really imported a lot of ideas back into the ancient world by framing it this way. Basically, because Cahana-Blum follows Jonas, he follows Jonas in saying that Gnostics are all anti-cosmic. That was Jonas's term. Cahana-Blum prefers the language of subversive and anti-traditional. And they are, as such, by the very fact that they are Gnostics, they are anti-traditional. Bracky is mostly praised, but according to Cahana-Blum, he unnecessarily delimits the Gnostic material to a single group in order to preserve the category of Gnostic. And although one would expect Cahana-Blum to embrace the theories of April Taconic, in fact, he's much more eager to distinguish himself from her method, calling her framework of framing of Gnosticism an, quote, atemporal type of spirituality, unquote, that can't help us understand the, quote unquote, ancient Gnostic mindset. So what's interesting here is that Cahana-Blum wants to position himself apparently as much more of a historian than April Taconic. But there's not really a serious engagement with her work, especially with her attempt to bring in cognitive science here. So overall, Cahana-Blum gives the impression that he's a bit punchy and wanting to, as many scholars do, carve out a space for their own scholarship, and really, in this case, go against the grain. In Chapter 1, Cahana-Blum lays out his methodology, and although he's primarily a follower of Jonas, he also follows Bentley Leighton's theory that Gnosticism, most often called Sethianism, is the sort of primal Gnostic movement, and out of it, Valentinians arose, and they were a Christianizing reform movement of the Gnostics, a reform movement which Cahana-Blum refers to as diluted. Basically, again, one gets the sense, although it's not said in direct terms, that Gnostics aren't Christians in their core identity. They can be Christianized. There seems to be a very strong division, even if implicit, between Gnosticism and Christianity, although some overlap is admitted. More striking, maybe, is Cahana-Blum's claim that we possess virtually no primary sources for Christian Gnosticism or Gnosticism, and the exceptions here would be just the citations and paraphrases from the heresiologists. So this is a very striking claim, and it's an amazingly striking claim because it really tends to undermine any kind of historical project, because in effect Cahana-Blum says that he's coming in here to do history, but basically says that there's almost no data to work with when doing history. And the real question for most historians is, well, where's the Nag Hammadi library? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. In effect, Cahana-Blum demotes all Nag Hammadi sources from being primary to secondary texts because he follows the particular theory that the Nag Hammadi codices were at one time placed in a monastic library. But not only that, Cahana-Blum goes on to make the additional, much more daring claim that the patriarchal monks edited the texts in the Nag Hammadi library. And in effect, Cahana-Blum doesn't say much to justify this claim. He mentions a possible new ending of Thunder, Perfect Mind, and he notes that an independent unit in the teachings of Salvanus is found elsewhere in monastic literature. And he also notes that, following Karen King, that there's a subtle shift in how gender is dealt with when you look at the versions of the Apocryphon of John, or the Secret Book of John. But really, in none of these cases does Cahana-Blum go in any depth to justify his theory of monastic editing. And these are only 3 out of some 50 Nag Hammadi texts, so is the claim really that patriarchal monks changed all the texts such that we can't really trust them? This is, frankly, a bit of a bold claim and not properly justified. It may be true, Cahana-Blum's theory may be true, that there was an ascetic masculinization of the text, and that certain libertine elements proclaiming a kind of sexual freedom were written out of the texts, or that those texts weren't copied, but really all of that is an argument from silence, and one must be very, very careful and circumspect about those sorts of claims. Chapter 2 is a very long chapter, and it's one in which Cahana-Blum combines a lot of his previous articles. But if I can give the very abbreviated version here, not going into the kind of depth which a full-scale review and critique would go into, Cahana-Blum makes basically 3 claims and has 3 sections to this chapter. The first is that so-called Gnostics were all anti-traditionalists by nature. And Cahana-Blum makes the claim that Greco-Roman culture is highly traditional. So if there's a group or groups that are highly anti-traditional, then they are indeed being subversive. One can question this claim both in terms of the overall generalization, whether in fact all of Greco-Roman culture is traditional, and whether in fact all so-called Gnostic groups are anti-traditional. I think one needs to investigate this claim very closely before making those sorts of generalizations. Cahana-Blum's evidence comes from Irenaeus, a heresiologist, but also Plotinus, Marcion, whom Cahana-Blum admits is not really Gnostic, the Second Discourse of Seth, the Apocryphon of John, and the Gospel of Thomas. One gets the sense that Cahana-Blum follows this sort of Harnakian traditionalist reading of Marcion, that Marcion rejects the Old Testament, but that's not really the case. fact, it's a bit of a straw man, because Marcion and his disciple Apelles heavily engaged the Septuagint, even though they don't accept it as scripture. And likewise, with books like the Second Discourse of Great Seth, Apocryphon of John, and the Gospel of Thomas, all of these have statements that can definitely be interpreted as highly critical of the Hebrew scriptures. The famous "not as Moses said" in the Apocryphon of John, and the critique of the 24 prophets in the Gospel of Thomas, and the mocking of the patriarchs and kings of Israel in the Second Discourse of Great Seth. But the thing also to keep in mind is that in each of these texts, Septuagintal traditions are also revised, and texts from the Hebrew Bible are also used. So you can't speak of an entirely blanket rejection of the Septuagint in these texts. I mean, in the most flagrant text, the Second Discourse of Great Seth, it's still attributed to Seth, who is a hero, or a figure made into a hero from the Septuagint. So that's important to keep in mind. The second section of this chapter goes into the topic of querying gender. And even though Cahana-Blum doesn't consider Nag Hammadi material primary material, he still abundantly uses it as if it was primary material. And in this case, he uses the Apocalypse of Adam. And in this text, Adam and Eve are originally androgynous, joined together, and it's an act of punishment for them to be split apart by the evil creator. And finally, in the section on resignifying gender through performative acts, Cahana-Blum tackles the Stratiatics and Fabianites in Epiphanius Panarion 26, making the claim that the same-sex acts performed by these groups was also an act of subverting patriarchy and heteronormativity and so on and so forth. That claim is interesting, and I think we need to take it seriously, but I'd like to focus on his treatment of the Naassenes, because I think there may be an instance of simple historical error here, because on the one hand, Cahana-Blum makes the claim that the Naasene primal deity is ungendered, or beyond gendered, but the text actually clearly says that Adamos, the primal deity, is androgynous, so he's dual gendered, or she is dual gendered, and we can't choose the pronoun here, so that claim is suspect. But also the claim that it is the lower creator who creates gender is also suspect because of that, because gender exists on the highest echelons of reality. And this is something we find in Sethianism as well. Barbelo is androgynous, a triple male, definitely both masculine and female and feminine. And so if gender is, or sex if you prefer, is at the highest levels of divinity, where the highest divine beings are combining masculine and feminine, then it's a very difficult claim to make, as Cahana-Blum seems to be making, that the Gnostics as a whole are saying that gender is, in essence, a bad thing and an evil creation. That just doesn't seem to hold historical water.
In order to prove his theory that Gnosticism is a kind of ancient cultural criticism, Cahana-Blum begins by comparing ancient Gnostics with the Frankfurt school, that is chiefly Adorno and Horkheimer, and their theory of the culture industry, which produces bondage and parades as something factual, but which is actually mythical. And there's an obvious overlap here with the idea of the conspiracy of the Archons, that the rulers are in fact using a system which systematically fools those people who are in that system, using their own desires and the temporary fulfillment of those desires as a way to enslave them. So, one of the chief categories that Cahana-Blum uses is nature. That nature, with a capital N, is often used to justify a particular social behavior. And so that's why Cahana-Blum pays special attention to nature when it's used in so-called Gnostic texts. And he has three chief examples. The first from the paraphrase of Shem, where an evil and perverted nature is the foe who destroys the people of Sodom. Then the Naseems, who argue, according to Cahana-Blum, that they should act against nature and engage in same-sex acts. And finally, the Gospel of Mary, which refers to the nature of adultery. The final text, the Gospel of Mary, Cahana-Blum admits, is quite ambiguous and lacunose, but he uses it anyway, and draws what I think are some very creative parallels between the Frankfurt School, radical feminism, and ancient Gnostic texts. The key overlap with radical feminism is that radical feminists actually critique the very concept of nature. And this is exactly what Cahana-Blum sees the Gnostics as doing. Now, the whole question here is whether this is historical research in the traditional sense, or whether this is something more like creative anachronism, where Cahana-Blum has taken his starting points from modern radical feminism and the Frankfurt School and simply read the Gnostic materials in light of these modern developments. Whatever the case may be, this is certainly a very creative and exciting comparison. Chapter 4 is one of the shorter chapters in the book, and as far as I can see is based entirely on new material not previously published. This might go some way in explaining why it seems somewhat on the underdeveloped side. What we have is an amazing and striking new paradigm for understanding Christian history, in which proto-Orthodoxy is an adaptive reform or transformation of quote-unquote Gnosticism. In other words, what we have is an attempt to reformulate Walter Bauer's Orthodoxy and heresy paradigm, and even to go beyond Karen King. So this is an astounding new announcement of a paradigm shift, and one very eagerly looks to how Cahana-Blum will prove or demonstrate his very bold thesis? Well, he turns to his main themes in the book, namely gender and traditionalism. And gender and sex, he claims, in Gnostic sources are an evil, overarching, and ultimately fictitious conspiracy, and are completely excluded by Gnostics. Now, on some level, I'm quite surprised by this remark because Cahana-Blum is also aware of texts which ascribe some sort of gender, or sex if you prefer, to the highest deity far above the creator. So if male and female are on some level above and prior to the evil creator, I honestly find it difficult to accept the generalization that Gnostics consider gender and sex as evil entirely. This seems to be something of a reduction and does not bear the weight with which one needs it to. On the issue of traditionalism, here again, it's a very fascinating discussion, but it's very short, barely a page long, and consists mostly of a quotation from the letters of Ignatius and the epistle of Diognetus. And it is, as this entire book is, an amazing and creative interpretation that Gnostics are anti-traditional to the core. But I think it doesn't quite do justice to the fact that even if you are anti-traditional, that itself is a kind of tradition. And as anti-tradition as so-called Gnostics were, they were also using tradition to establish and knock down other traditions. So although I think this is an amazing thesis and Cahana-Blum may have much more material to work it out, ultimately what I look forward to is a much longer argument to prove this new paradigm. And if this is taken as a historical statement that proto-orthodoxy is an adapted reform of Gnosticism, then Cahana-Blum would have to do an incredible amount of work establishing some sort of temporal priority of quote-unquote Gnosticism or Gnostic Christianity. And I very much look forward to his further work down the road. The concluding chapter is mostly a summary of what Cahana-Blum believes that he has accomplished throughout the book. It is a warning, in the end, not to pathologize or to normalize Gnosticism. And although, again, Cahana-Blum takes the opportunity to basically separate himself from April DeConnick, I see his work as in basic agreement with April DeConnick's emphases, one of which is that Gnosticism is dependent upon transgression. And of course, Cahana-Blum is correct that this goes back in some way to the interpretation of Hans Jonas. And I think ultimately both scholars would admit that. One can agree with Cahana-Blum that Gnosticism is a, quote, well-demarcated cultural movement in late antiquity, unquote. At the same time, I think that, or rather I hope that this book is only the beginning of Cahana-Blum's attempt at a paradigm shift. I think this book is generally well written and accessible, and I would recommend it to everyone trying to think about Gnostic texts, regardless of where you are. It is a thought-provoking and exciting new avenue of research. And again, I look forward to the filling out, as it were, and the additional scholarly justification for this exciting new paradigm.